what time it is. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. Let's be heard. Welcome to a special edition of the Mike G in the Morning program from Hollywood, California. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike G, and you're participating in Mike G in the Morning with The Law Matters. And you have a home in the Mike G in the Morning family. By the way, I want to give a special thanks to Donald Trump Jr. for sharing one of the clips from last week's episode. We've got a very special guest here with us today. He commented on one of the Liberals for Trump posts with two powerful words, hard same. Ladies and gentlemen, Nathan. Nathan, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, I know almost nothing about you, but when you commented hard same, I took a look at your profile and I said, we have got to get this guy on the show. Get this guy on the show right now. What did you mean when you said hard same?
Long story, short story.
Give me the long story. We're here for the long haul.
Long story. Literally, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania. Very conservative family background. But then, never necessarily resonated with politics. If anything, I was very much a counterculture kid, skateboarder, listened to hip hop, golden era of 90s hip hop, Wu-Tang Clan, big fan of theirs. And, so I had this counterculture mindset. So then when I kind of started identifying with politics, especially when I moved to Los Angeles in 2008, I definitely leaned toward the liberal side of things. At that time, the Democratic Party was still very much a home for, I think the populist but still counterculture mindset, right? Backtrack a little bit, when you look at what was happening in politics with Al Gore versus George W. Bush, it was very much still almost still anti-establishment 100%. You had Rage Against the Machine out here downtown LA protesting the DNC convention. But there was something that happened with Obama, right, that kind of made all of us counterculture kids feel like, hey, this one's for us, And it was right when I moved to LA. I got very caught up in that movement. There's pictures of me at beginning of my DJ career here in Los Angeles wearing the hit and run Obama shirts, and through that presidency, there were some things that started wearing at me, right? The stop and frisk law was happening in New York City, which Obama was pretty quiet on. There was things like the 99% movement and the banking failures in 2008. I was out protesting as a part of the 99% with that, so I was getting more involved on the ground with politics. And, but you started seeing those threads kind of come out during the Obama presidency, right? It's where are we really aligned? Then kind of during those two terms, I was also had a big awakening in terms of my health and how I was eating and how basically, finding out about GMOs, finding about Monsanto, finding out about how I could really empower myself through my diet and my lifestyle to, again, kind of in the counterculture ethos, F the man, right? There are these, I started finding out that these huge companies, they had the data that they knew that these foods are not beneficial. They have food scientists working to program our minds to basically, to want to have certain foods, right? And so then the healthcare thing was a big thing for me during Obama's presidency. We were trying to go for one payer system, but then it ended up being that, no, we're mandated now to have insurance, right? I have a lot of distrust in the insurance companies. I had a lot of distrust in the medical industry going back to my childhood, right? And so then to kind of get thrown into to have to be their customer or else face a tax burden was very unsettling for me, right? Especially as I was coming into this awareness of actually I could empower myself through my lifestyle to not need this group of people in my life, right? About the freedom of choice. Flash forward, Mike Brown, BLM movement, the original Instagram woke movement, right? It was a spiritual context behind kind of what was going on in that movement. It wasn't so much just political. Political was part of it, But the big part of it was, a short term for enlightenment, short term with connecting with God. This also falls into my belief system now with food and wellness, because to me, those are the resources that we've been provided. For me, easiest word to say it is from God, right? So again, I'm starting to lose resonance with this group of people politically. I'm starting now to realize maybe this Obama guy doesn't have all of our best interests in mind. Flash forward, then we get Bernie Sanders. I was a big Bernie Sanders supporter. As a person who grew up in rural Pennsylvania, this guy was speaking in somewhat to the problems that were going on with my family, with my friends that I knew still were back in Pennsylvania, dealing with the problems that rural people are dealing with. I didn't feel like Hillary Clinton represented all of America in that context. She was only speaking to even a small percentage of the people kind of in the cities, but really missing the mark in the rural communities, which was what was so inspiring to me about Bernie Sanders. I thought this guy really could, if my family was going to vote for a Democrat, it was going to be Bernie Sanders, right? And then for me, it was plainly obvious that there was what seemed like an agenda to not give Bernie Sanders airtime. He had a lot of momentum on the internet, but when I would watch MSNBC, which I thought were the people of, they're supposed to be non-biased, but we've kind of moved beyond that. News stations now are very biased, sure. Right? But from my perspective, I come home and I watch it, and I'm just like, where's the talk about Bernie? Like, this guy's got momentum. He's got charisma. He's speaking to a large population of people, right? That seemingly cross his borders, because he's talking about rural issues, but he's also talking about the control mechanisms behind the media, behind big corporations, behind big pharma, right? And so now that's speaking to this myself as a person who is distrusting big pharma, is skeptical of big government, is skeptical of media corporations, is skeptical of corporate power in general, especially when it comes to food. And it seemed very much to me that there was an agenda to get him off the ballot, or at least put him in the shadows of Hillary Clinton. Going forward, you start to see WikiLeaks, right? When the WikiLeaks dropped in 2016, which then became the whole part of the Russia collusion thing, you see how basically WikiLeaks, it was a whole treasure trove of information. But one of the big highlights in that drop was basically saying, hey, yeah, the DNC was working with big media to create this narrative that it's got to be Hillary versus Trump. And they had to use Trump as that evil villain to make it even more powerful as the reason as to why we needed to vote for Hillary, right? Because Bernie didn't stand a chance. What I was looking forward to the most in 2016 was a debate between Bernie and Trump, right? And at that point, I was not even that aware of Trump. I didn't watch the Republican debates, right?
You missed out on some high-level entertainment, by the way.
I did, and I've gone back and watched them, since. But again, from this person that I was feeling I was very liberal, right? It was like this guy that was actually speaking my language. There was a big, again, seemingly agenda to not have his voice heard, therefore not having my voice heard, right? So 2016, I ended up voting for Hillary. It was a wild thing because as I pressed the button, I heard this cackle in my brain, very much maybe that wasn't the right thing. Maybe I fed into the fear. I didn't have so much faith. I fed into the fear of hey, Trump is going to incite racists. He's going to incite all these people. So where the hard same gets in, what I resonated with that post was then, that's when I started really paying attention, that first few months of Trump's presidency, seeing how seemingly every month there was World War III was on the brink. Nuclear war was on the brink. He's going to bring us to war with North Korea. It was the first time I was at a new job where I actually had an MSN browser. So I was getting Microsoft News every day. And every day it's telling me my life is in danger. Very much what I consider now fear propaganda, right? And coming out of the pocket of counterculture, coming out of the pocket of, hey, we're supposed to be loving people. Liberalism was supposed to, for me, about, debate. It was about free speech. It was about being heard on any type of platform. and it started shrinking. That gap started shrinking, and it became very hateful, right? And so, one of Michelle Obama's famous quotes was, when they go low, we go high. And that's what I resonated with and what I responded hard saying, because it was like, where did that go? So at some point during the first Trump presidency, all of that idea of continuing the high road, being compassionate, hearing your neighbor, having sentiments of free speech, it seemed like it all went out the window, right? There was visceral, I'll say, hate for Donald Trump. People in my family that I love very dearly, they voted for Trump, right? Because of the global geopolitics involved. I didn't understand their point of view at the time. But then as time went on, and I'm seeing how, friends of mine, other family members of mine had this visceral, emotional dislike and even sometimes often said hate for Donald Trump, it seemed I became much more anti that than even pro-Trump, And that's when that started leading me to like, what's actually this dude saying? Like, let me like get beyond the clips, right? The big thing was the shooting. I forget which, in the South, when he said there's good people on both sides. When you take that clip into full context, like he was vehemently, disavowing white supremacy.
Right.
Right? But they cut that part out, played the clip over and over and over and over again to emotionalize the base. And that's when really, like, I just started opening my mind up to other possibilities, right? And then, again, leaning more out of liberalism than even embracing conservatism. And then I've really started looking at definitions of words. I was presented with the idea of etymology and really studying etymology and what do words mean. Then you look up Democrat versus Republican. A republic, a democracy is a part of a republic, but it doesn't go the other way around sometimes, right? Because in a pure democracy, there could be mob rule. We could have voted initially to have George Washington as a king, right? But this idea of a republic that the minority voice does matter, right? And that's why when you go back historically, the first melanated, so-called black people were a huge part of the Republican Party because at that time we had to protect their interest, right? Coming out of Abraham Lincoln, coming out of the Civil War. So again, there's a lot of debate on how that big switch happened and how then the Republican Party became known as, the racist party, but there was a lot of discrepancy on both sides, I think, for a lot of years. And then you go back and you listen to Malcolm X, and he's talking about literally the white liberal, the power structures, and now all of a sudden my mind's starting to put these connections together, and now I'm seeing it play out. I'm seeing how friends and family are emotionalized. My wife is a melanated so-called black woman, right? She doesn't necessarily agree with the full liberal package, if you will. But she's told in a certain context that she has to agree or she's not smart enough to understand what's good for her, right? And my wife is one of the smartest people I've ever met and can debate mostly anybody and can debate me under the table. And so to think that she isn't smart enough to make up her own mind as somebody who studied political science, again, that stuff was what leaned me out more of being liberal than even me saying that, like, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican, or even a Trump supporter. So that's kind of the majority of how I led to that conclusion. And then you get into COVID, and I don't think Trump handled that 100% well all the time, right? But the thing that stuck with me I read every piece of literature or piece of law that they wrote from his administration, and everything said choice. And I'm somebody who believes in free speech. I'm somebody who believes in choice. I'd rather debate things and allow people to draw their own conclusions and make their own choices. So now to mandate it versus somebody that's saying, hey, we're going to create this medicine, but it's for anybody who chooses it. That was a big line in the sand for me. And then, why I eventually voted for Trump in 2020.
There's a lot to unpack there. First thing I want to talk about is you go back and Jonathan Chaffin, the original liberal for Trump, who we got to thank him for making this possible,
100%.
getting you on this program. But last week he was talking about how he protested the Iraq War, and he thought it was an unjust invasion. And I think that a lot of people on the right have come around to that since.
100%.
And you were talking about how the culture that you were involved with, there was sort of a change somewhere in there. And it's interesting how they claimed that Trump was going to get us into World War III, as you were saying. And every day we were on the brink of World War III. And in reality, we're seeing that he's now the anti-war candidate. Is that fair to say?
I would agree. And what I love the most about when they were basically setting him up in that one town hall, they were like, you got to pick a winner, right? And a great diplomat doesn't look at things in terms of winning and losing. I think a great thinker moving into what in the spiritual realm is considered the fifth dimension, right, is that everyone is good and everyone has bad, right? And so you can't draw these lines in the sand of like, these people are good and these people are bad, so we need these people to win so these people can lose, right? He said, I want people to stop dying. And the host in that town hall just kept pushing the issue. But don't you want Russia to lose? And he's just like, I just want people to stop dying. You know, so I think again, that's peace, right? That's how you in a good compromise, both people are giving and losing a little bit, or giving and taking a little bit, right? And finding the space in the middle. And I think that's where somebody who's coming from a business background, who works in the reality and not the polarization of global politics, I feel like he has an upper hand in those type of negotiations where people that need to be on one side of an argument to maintain their identity in said argument is very dangerous.
What do you think it is that makes some people who relate to Bernie also relate to Trump? Because that's not something that is unheard of. You know, Bernie, you have a self-declared democratic socialist, and you'd find that the vast majority of people on the right, they hear this word socialism, and they want no parts of it. Mm-hmm. And from my perspective, understandably. But there's something about both Bernie and Trump that there's a certain segment of the people who can relate to each of them. What do you think that is?
I think that goes back to the core counterculture, right? I feel, and that's why I was so looking forward to that debate, because especially if we could have had it in 2020, because to me, in my perspective, they're saying the same thing. Trump just names the names. Bernie leaves things in a more ubiquitous term, saying big pharma, big media, where Trump's saying like, no, you did this, you and your friends, you know. And I think there was one of the first like big events he did in Washington where he called out those people. And then when you go back and you watch that Republican debate, he calls out those donors. You know, he called them out right there in front of everybody. And I think that's the biggest difference. And I think that's why even moving into 2020, I lost resonance with Bernie, because it seemed like he lost that strength. He had to keep things in the coded language, right? Where I think Trump does also use a lot of coded language, but it's on a whole other level, right? Of like, of Klingon chess, if you will. He's playing this thing from a whole different bunch of angles. These bureaucrats they're not elected officials. They work under the radar, and nobody really knows who they are, because we've been, dealing with American Idol, if you will, in terms of politics. We look at it as the guy on the top is the end-all be-all in this whole game, and for the people that are really behind the scenes, that's the best case scenario. Because if they can just get us to focus on Clinton, Obama, Bush, right? But then you see the photos of all of them hanging out. Really, do they really have when we're out here fighting in the streets to back these candidates, and they're chummy, they're having cigars, they're part of the same, inner circle that George Carlin talked about. You know what I'm saying? That Bernie tried to call out, that Trump called out very clearly. I think that's where you see that resonance, because it's the same group of people. It's a shadow government. It's people that are not elected, right? It's people that are taking contracts. It's who gets the money. When we're sending money to Ukraine, when we're sending money to, Israel, and in these conflicts, right? There's contracts that are signed. So who's getting the benefit of those contracts? And whose interest do they have in mind? And then who's loaning that money? Because this all can go, you want to really get deep, it goes back to the creation of the Federal Reserve and how we even, now why we have to pay taxes at the level that we do, right? So I think all that feeds in itself, and when there's really one truth from many perspectives. And it's just how those two gentlemen really were doing their best to kind of make the American citizens aware of that, not everything is quite as it seems.
But do you think that in 2016, at least, Trump and Bernie were both different versions of America First?
100%.
Maybe they had different ways of getting there, and people on the right would disagree with Bernie's way of getting there. But it was an America First sort of thing, because you look back, and we've talked about this on the program, but Bernie took a hard stance against illegal immigration in 2015 in a Vox interview. And his position was that you have unemployed minority youth here in the United States of America, and open borders as a Koch brothers policy is what he called it, because he said that these big corporations would love to have people come in under the radar and pay them $2 or $3 an hour and have cheap labor, when instead we should be focused on employing people in the United States of America, which he could never say that today, right? Do you think that in 2020 he sort of got off of that and went more towards the establishment? Because I don't think he would have said that in 2020 even.
In 2020, I think it was the jig was already kind of up. And from my perspective, you saw on Super Tuesday, I think at that point Bernie was either very much the leading candidate. I think Elizabeth, and I could be 100% wrong on, but I believe Bernie was right up there with about 35% of the vote. Elizabeth Warren was almost right behind him, and Joe Biden was actually kind of like down in the mix, right? He was not the top contender.
Most people thought he was done,
right? But again, what it seemed like the agenda and outside perspective, it was a very convenient time for people that still had a pretty strong shot. They all kind of dropped out and they all towed the line, because then even you see the conversation as to, a lot of my friends, say, well, that was a smart move politically for the party because, Bernie might not have taken the win versus Trump. So if we all get behind Joe Biden, right? That's the smoke and mirrors. Now we get behind Joe Biden, and now we got a shot, and now we can win this thing. And that's what ended up happening. And now you literally see the repercussions of that, because you have a career politician that literally will say anything. We'll talk about track records. What he was saying in the 90s, I mean, he literally, the guy that created the crime bill, what he's said has been so inconsistent, right, in his time as a politician. I think the writing was on the wall for Bernie, and I think he was trying to play a survival game at that point, and he was way less on the offensive and just trying to survive within that party, and has really since just been a line tower now, where he was a kind of a rebel in that world. Now he's just a guy that really seems like his soul has been crushed, and I don't see that same fighting spirit in him that we saw in 2016 whatsoever.
Why do you think people take that position, though? Let's get behind this guy, even though he doesn't align with our interests, for the sake of the party winning the election.
I think that's the danger of identity politics, in the sense not that, the political parties use our identity to emotionalize us to get us to back a candidate, but then there's the other layer of this is my team, and sometimes we're too clouded by the winning and loss mentality that we can't look at it from a bird's eye view and say, actually, what's like the best for right now? And I think a lot of people thought that might have been the best for right now. And at that point, there was also, there was 4 years of negative propaganda against Trump that was never really that proven. That's why he was, not impeached fully. That's why when we found out about the Steele dossier, it was very much a very gray situation that the FBI has come back and since said we're going to change our policies because we didn't really vet this stuff as well as we could have. So I think by that point in 2020, you had the riots in the streets coming off of, the guy's name's escaping me, but the gentleman that, died under police custody.
Floyd.
George Floyd. So it was just a very emotional time. And I think that's the biggest danger in politics is that, Malcolm X said, the media will make you think that the good guy is the bad guy and vice versa. I'm not quoting that exactly, but that's the sentiment, right? And that's what happened, right? You saw how somebody who was putting out plans for Americans, who was looking at, the interests of all Americans, the media, cut clips. They left a very short sum of information when there was a lot more to the equation, right? And so then you have this emotionalism that's generated, and I think people are already operating out of a lot of trauma and propaganda. And they had their identities emotionalized against them, whether it's just, counterculture rebellious types, whether it's the LGBTQ community, whether it's the so-called, black melanated community, everyone was emotionalized. And so you're not at that level, you're not seeing things from a grounded point of view or the bird's eye view.
And it's difficult this day and age to figure out what's really going on because it's difficult sometimes to find the full source. We were talking about this with our last guest, but you'll read a headline about a court case, let's say, and you can scroll through that article, you get somebody's opinion on that court case, you'll get that wild headline, but it won't have a link to the actual opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to do some real digging to get to that opinion by the court and read it for yourself. And it's the same with many other source documents. But when you see what happened just recently with this bloodbath situation, we had a portion on the show where we discussed it. We had a clip where we put it out there. And you have somebody commenting under one of the clips just last week. Well, Trump said it's going to be a bloodbath if he loses the election. People are not picking up on this stuff. They're watching it and they're not seeing the full picture for themselves. What do you think is going on? Is anything going to change that, or are there certain people who they're never going to come around to it?
There's a quote that I love that says, sometimes you can't tell people, you have to show people. And what I've witnessed in the last 8 years gives me a lot of faith. That unfortunately, there's sometimes there's a lot of bad you have to go through to get to the good. And I've seen a lot of people change their minds. I've really been watching from the peripheral. I've done my best to kind of engage with people when I can. But I've really been putting my effort into action and just kind of watching things unfold. And what I'm seeing, it makes me optimistic because people are on a certain level waking up to things, and they're looking at things from a lot of different perspectives. From a spiritual context, I think that God works in paradoxes, and he creates situations where, you have to look at things differently. Look at Candace Owens right now, right? Like, she's somebody that's been now critical of Israel, and now is getting a situation where she'd be essentially agreeing with the left. Right? And I don't think that she's necessarily pro-Palestine, but she's questioning Israel, right? What are their motives? There's a lot to question in there, right? And I love Jewish people, but like the state of Israel and what Israel does and what they've done for a long time, and same with, any of the Five Eyes, CIA-driven intelligence agencies, you have to take with a grain of salt, and you have to understand like what's actually going on. There's so much evidence that says that this is not a great program, and these people are not always, some of maybe the intention's good, but the follow through and the methodology is pretty gnarly, So I think that these paradoxes are coming around, and you see them more and more every day. The illegal immigration situation that's now taking, black people in Chicago who've always voted Democrat, and now they're like, hey, we still don't have money for you guys, but we're gonna give shelter, we're gonna give money, we're gonna give all this money to illegal immigrants. It's like, where's the actual practical solution, right? And when I learned a lot, I used to own my own business, and I learned a lot about what I perceived as reality and what is actual reality, right? And the big thing I learned in that situation was that in a business, you can come to zero. And, if you don't have any income, the outcome, right? You're gonna go out of business. The government, unfortunately, the way everything's set up, they just keep taking more tax money. So when there's not an actual pragmatic, grounded solution, that people that are paying this tax money, 30% or more, when you're not even including sales tax and property tax and all these other taxes that we have, eventually they're going to start at like, what am I paying for? Where's my paycheck going, right? And I think that is one of the big, again, there's a couple different things happening right now, but there are these paradoxical situations that's happening that's making people start to look at things from a less black and white perspective.
And as a business owner, did that make you a little bit leery about the quote unquote democratic socialists out there and giving the government more power? Because the more power you give the government, the more free reign they have to be extremely inefficient with your tax dollars. Isn't that true?
100%. And I think it's just about transparency. You know, like I think there's a lot of things to be skeptical about blockchain technology. And I think governments using blockchain technology is kind of scary to think about. But at the same time, if it can create a level of transparency, you know, like the taxes are the only thing that you pay for and you don't get a receipt. Like there's nothing that you can get a receipt back from the government that just says, line by line, this is what your taxes went towards or paid for. You know, we just saw an omnibus bill that's passed by, you know, again, it's not a black and white issue. Republicans and Democrats voted for this bill, right? Trillions of dollars. Like the fact that we're even in that nomenclature and talking about money at that degree is insane to me, right? But it's not so much about even the numbers, it's about the transparency and where that's going. We're sending billions of dollars to Ukraine, right? And in a war that like Joe Biden predicted earlier in his career, saying if NATO continue to encroach on Russia, this is not going to be a good scenario for us, right? But when it becomes politically popular to toe that line, that's where he's landing at now.
Does it make any sense to you that people say that Trump and Putin are best buddies, and yet Putin decided to invade Ukraine at this point in time after Trump left office? Does that make any sense to you? Why wouldn't he do it when his quote-unquote buddy was in office, where he wouldn't have the resistance?
At that level, I think that's when you're starting to get into this like Klingon 5D chess, right?
Or is it possible that they're not buddies after all?
I think that they're buddies in the sense that like there's very much globalist agenda, and there's the idea that countries should be sovereign and be able to make the best decision for their people, right? And I think where you see the opportunity for an allyship with the President Trump and a Putin is that they're both principled, sovereign-minded thinkers, right? They want the best for their people, and then, you know, hopefully that can spread out. And so when you look at a situation like Ukraine, you can't separate that from our involvement with, you know, the coup that happened, right? They had a democratically elected person that was not favorable to the United States or what we wanted. I think that was back in 2014, right? So then there was a coup that happened that a lot of people are thinking that, you know, we had some involvement with. And again, I don't know the facts 100% behind that, but when you look at our history and what we've done, again, as a counterculture thinker, you look at what we did around the world numerous times. If administrations are not favorable to the United States, we figure out how to make them favorable to us in one shape or another. So then when you see the Ukraine happen, and you see that basically Lindsey Graham, John McCain, Klobuchar are in the Ukraine talking to Ukrainian soldiers about 2016 is going to be the offensive. So we're going to go on the offensive against this guy, right? That speaks to me of more of this globalist agenda. This agenda that isn't concerned with what Americans need, what the Russians need, what the Ukrainians need, but what's good for business.
But I think that what you described is more of maybe people who have to work with one another in some capacity and have a healthy respect for one another, but not necessarily buddies. Because when I say buddies, it would seem that if he's going to go into Ukraine and he's got Trump in his pocket, as they claim,
Right.
that he would be met with no resistance and no assistance from the United States. But he didn't do that. Wouldn't that make more sense to do if that were true?
Again, I think it might be just less black and white than that. You know, it might be less black and white that like, hey, there was a respect there. There was a respect that like under Trump, we would have done our best to not encroach any farther, right? And so that NATO was playing a different position because Trump has been the only person that says, hey, NATO, like European countries got to you got to chip in on this,
Is
right?
that unreasonable?
And not at all. I think I think it's ironic in a lot of cases where a lot of people want to talk about how great Europe is, but like Europe only exists on the legs of colonialism and American imperialism, right? If they didn't have us fighting their battles, going back to the world wars, and then having our allyship, Europe isn't where it is, right? France is still making money, has their banks set up in Africa, right? Their colonial outreach is still there. Great Britain's colonial outreach, I think if you look it up, is like it only ended in like the late 90s or even the early 2000s. So kind of the dates are, I don't have those exact. I don't claim to be a political science major, but like I'm just an intuitive person that kind of doing my best to look at the whole picture, right? And it seems like these people are very much set up based on the fact that, again, they've had their colonial institutions set up and they have us fighting for them. And then that makes American companies and global companies like Raytheon a lot of money.
I want to go back to owning your own business. What time period was that?
We started the project in like late 2013. We ended up opening the business in 2015, and it was a short-lived business that we made it till like 3/4 of the year in 2015.
And what were some of the challenges that you faced as a business? And this is here in California, right?
Yeah, it was here in California. To be honest, for me, it had very little to do with politics or anything. Some of the challenges were, of course, working with the city, but a lot of it was my own, naive thinking, my own lack of business acumen. I was really good at producing something. I had a juice company in Hollywood, right down Cahuenga from where we're at, actually, on Melrose and Cahuenga. And I just made a lot of mistakes. If I would have watched a year's worth of Shark Tank, I would have been even a lot more fitted to run my business, but I had a lot of ego. I thought that if I just made the best thing possible, everything else would kind of take care of itself. I didn't understand the grounded reality of accounting, right? And like how to really budget for things, and then when things go awry, you have a contractor that just leaves one day because they had a better opportunity, even though you have a contract and a bond. But then it's like you find out a lot about a contract doesn't really matter if you don't have the right lawyers and the money to enforce that contract. So that was kind of a political, legal understanding that I didn't have, that you just think, well, it's right is right, wrong is wrong. But, at a certain level, you got to pay to be able to enforce those contracts, right? So, my business was, again, short-lived because it was mostly my mistakes, and the lessons that I had to learn as a business owner. I've had the good fortune of being able to consult, work with a lot of great companies, and learn a lot in the last almost 10 years now. So if I ever get that opportunity again in the future, I'm going to be much more well-suited for it. But I think the hard lesson relative to, again, politics was just realizing that, like, you can come to zero. As a private business, like, there's an end game. And if you can't figure out how to make that matrix work in 100 percentile and understand how to budget things and make it work, you're gonna go out of business.
Did that give you a different perspective on things in the sense that you had to be on 24 hours a day because you were responsible for the whole of the business?
100%. And that's where, like, right now I have a lot more compassion for what small businesses are going through, because there's a lot of ideas that get emotionalized and propagated into the population that your boss hates you, that the guy at the top is they use the McDonald's, the Walmarts as the examples, and then they think everyone should get paid a certain amount of money, livable wage, but like, what is that even? How do you even equate that? Like, my standards of living are completely different than somebody else's standards of living. Where I choose to rent my house, there's an average, but there's only one like individual reality in how you're budgeting that money. So it gave me a lot more empathy for a lot of my previous employers that I thought I knew better than. Why don't you're in a boom period, why aren't you paying us all more money now, right? But then come to find out 5 years later, the company that was first to market, they lose a lot of market share because 5 businesses doing the exact same idea open up in the same community. And now that market share is spread out between 5 businesses instead of 1. And if that business was paying me what I thought I was entitled to in that boom period, they wouldn't be here. But because he was pragmatic and did what was needed for his business, that place, which was Naturewell in Silver Lake, is still in business. They've since sold it to another person, but the original owner, Tony, he still has 2 of his locations. And that was my entitlement, thinking, well, we're busy. You can see all these people in here. We deserve more. And then having my own business really helped me understand that, like you're saying, you're 24/7. You know, an employee can clock out. They're going to go home. They can literally say, I quit. And I've done that at that job. There was a day that I went in and I didn't like the way I was being managed. And I said, hey, I didn't come here for this. I came here for music. I quit, right? And that's the freedom you get to have as an employee. When your name's on the bottom line and you're responsible for your contracts and your rent and your loans, it's a much different game. You know, and I think that was some awareness that I needed to have more compassion to be even effective in the roles that I've had since I had my business. Because I work in health and wellness. I've been opening juice bars ever since. I work at a wonderful company now, Erewhon in LA. And but before I got hired here at Erewhon, I was doing a lot of consulting and I was helping small businesses, and I was able to navigate that because I had a lot of empathy and compassion for what these business owners are going through, knowing that they had a heart-centered business. That most of the people that are doing juice bars, smoothie bars, coffee shops, it's a passion project, right? They're not looking at this to become a multimillionaire. They're looking at this because most of the time they've had a life-changing experience with that food, and they want to offer that to other people, right? And so those people need a voice. Those people need to have a space to be able to work in, and not necessarily, you know, it's not fair to judge those businesses by McDonald's, by Walmart, by the hugest corporations in our country. But that's what politics does. That's what the short-term, short-form, media glance that they give us on the major news networks, they don't really speak for those people. They speak for the large corporations, the pharmaceutical companies that's paying for 90% of their budget, because when you watch a TV show, most of the ads are coming from huge corporations and huge pharmaceutical companies.
Did you have some kind of life-changing experience?
I did. It was my own, but my wife's was even a bigger win than my own. I was dealing with things like congested sinuses, right? Doctors told me, well, you're allergic. They didn't tell me what I was allergic to. They just prescribed me some stuff, right?
You're just allergic in general?
Just allergic, right? But my wife had been in and out of hospitals since, she was in her teenage years. At some of the best, what are considered our best institutions that we have, Cedars-Sinai, UCLA Medical. And they just kind of told her at some point, what you're dealing with doesn't fit our chart. So this is kind of just on you, right? And what I learned, what I felt like I was blessed with coming back to what I would say, I went back to work. I had left the music industry. I didn't really leave the music industry. I just wasn't as successful as I would have liked. I needed to pay my bills, so I had to get a job. And through working back in juice bars and health and wellness, I got turned on to some really great ideas of how I could empower myself, and how we could empower ourselves in our household. And all of those issues that both of us had, I also had really gnarly indigestion. So one of my bad guys is always Larry the Cable Guy and Prilosec, right? Because they want to tell you that that's your problem, right? They don't want to give you the causative fact, which is like the food that you're eating, most of the time in my experience, is what's causing, right, the indigestion. It's what's causing the inflammation. They want you to continue that lifestyle so then you can buy, William Cooper, problem, reaction, solution. Same group of people oftentimes are creating the problem.
Problem, reaction,
solution. So, if as us as a group of corporations and a bunch of investment pool, we know that big food is causing people indigestion. The reaction is the indigestion and how bad somebody feels. The solution is the Prilosec, right? When if you go back and you say, actually, the causation of the problem is that food, now I can empower myself and just say, I don't need to eat that food, right? And that kind of spoke to my counterculture rebellious side, because I'm just like, F you guys. Like, I thought I had a problem with Doritos, but come to find, like, the Doritos are literally engineered by food scientists to make me want to eat a whole bag. And yeah, I could have had more self-discipline and more self-control. I'm sure there's a lot of people that can exert that. But at the same time, you have to understand that they're engineering food to make you desire it more, to make it, hit certain synapses in your brain that are going to release neurochemicals that are going to make this a desirable experience, right? And make you want to replicate it. So, we were able to basically completely change our life, and it was heartbreaking to see my wife go through what she was going through so often. And to now have the experience where those issues are not even something that we really think about, and we're not even as strict as we were when we first made that big shift, it's what keeps me inspired. It allows me to do what I do every day, because I know that there's other realities outside of what's considered the norm.
It's amazing. Now, you also are a Christian, right?
I grew up Lutheran, and just recently I've really come to resonance with Jesus, and I've had a whole wonderful life experience just in the relative last couple months, and so I still don't feel 100% comfortable with like the term Christian. I don't know that Jesus would have even called himself a Christian, right? But I've been a disciple of Jesus, and I've been reading the Bible and finding just a lot of just psychedelic trippiness in my life, and resonance with what's in that book, right? And listening to a lot of Sunday service from a couple years ago, and Ye talks about how we judge the church and we judge Christ by judging people. But we're people. And that was my experience as a kid. Like, I grew up with a single, from about 10, I grew up with a single mother, and it might have been my own paranoia, but I just felt judged. I felt judged because I couldn't go to the church things as much as other people could, because my church was also a daycare, and there was a little cliquishness, because if you were going to that daycare and then going to the church, you already had that built-in base, right? Where my mom couldn't afford the daycare, I was going with my grandmother in the afternoon. So I started judging Christ by judging the people at church. And I stopped taking communion when I was 18, and then I kind of went on my own path. I dabbled in some atheism until I went to an atheist AA meeting and found some of the most miserable people I've ever met. And then I found some amazing rooms here in Los Angeles that were very much about the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and really working that program. And so I found that I wasn't an alcoholic. I was really a person that was dealing with childhood trauma, and I was using cannabis as a way to work through that trauma over time. And just recently, I was dealing with some just congestion, and the second time in probably the last 12 years, I was dealing with this like heavy congestion, and I still kept smoking. And both are part of my story with my relationship with Jesus, because the first time it happened, I was working in a juice bar in Eagle Rock, and again, I've been dealing with this cough for about a month, and I was in the back, literally in the bathroom, and I just prayed, because at that point I was coming to resonance with God, and it was very apparent to me that hey, I didn't make the sun come up, but something's making this thing work. I didn't create this, and that's what I learned from AA. Was giving that power over to God. It didn't have to be Jesus. I had to recognize that it wasn't me, And so I resonated with God, and in that moment, I prayed to God and said, hey, let me just quit smoking weed for 3 or 4 days here. Let me just give this a break so I can let my lungs heal. And then I'm gonna go back to smoking, but let me just heal for right now. And a couple hours later, a woman came in, and her friend grabbed a couple juices. They left. About 15 minutes later, they came back, and the woman said to me, she's like, Nathan, I just want to tell you something. Jesus put something on my heart, and I want to let you know. And I was just sure, go ahead. complete skeptic. Like, yeah, sure. But I'm a psychedelic dude, so I'm not very like, psychic connection. That's like, that's not far out to me either, right? But she said to me, she said, Jesus put this on my heart to tell you, all of your addictions and everything that you're going through, it's going to be okay. And that was the first time I was like, okay, logically, I just prayed about this an hour ago. What's the mathematical probability that somebody's going to walk into this building? I've worked in retail my entire life. No one has ever said anything to me like that. So to do that after an hour after I just prayed to God to help me with that exact same thing, started opening my mind up to Jesus. And so, but I went to a church and I started judging Christ by judging the church because they were very, the devil, it started off good, but then it was like very much the devil and be afraid of the devil and fear the enemy type of thing. And it was just like, that I didn't resonate with. Like, I can be grateful to God, but I don't need to be like out here afraid of the devil, right? So that kind of led me on my journey, and flash forward to, a whole lot of esoteric philosophical studies, read a lot of books, like adjacent to the Bible. I've read a book called The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ, which is basically the New Testament without a lot of the kind of like, so what I would say almost like some of the problematic language that I believe that the Catholics put in there during the Nicene Convention, to try to get that unison republic ideology. That's what Catholicism ended up being. And so that even opened up my mind. And then so I'm like, okay, so I'm starting to resonate a little bit more with this. I'm not going to say Jesus. I'm not really praying to Jesus, but I'm praying to God, and this is part of my path with Jesus. And for some reason, I just started listening to the Sunday service, and it just started like, something started to click. Something started to click. And then about 2 months ago, again, same thing happened with my lungs, where I was just like, I woke up on a Saturday morning, my day's off, so I'm ripping some bongs, and it was just like, what are you doing, Nathan? Like, you gotta let this go. Like, you're not in good shape right now, and for some reason, you keep coming back to this thing. And I got on my yoga mat, I started stretching, and I heard ultralight beams, like loud in my mind, like faith, like just that part in that song. And in that moment, I was like, I'm gonna let this go, and I want to start going to church. And then I found a church in my neighborhood that I've been going to, like literally just like the last 3 weeks. So I'm not claiming like born again-ness, I'm not claiming like Jesus warrior or anything, but it's just like on every ounce of my being now, I'm just like, I'm leaning into it, and it's like almost like an experiment where it's like I'm believing in, like, let me just put my faith into this person. Like I feel like there's enough evidence that says, even archaeological, that this guy was here, right? I think, in Judaism, they're not disagreeing that he was around, right? Historically, we're not disagreeing he was around, but it's just like, what's the true story? And then is he really the Messiah? And then you get into like, what was brought in from the kind of the pagan faiths at the time that were then included into Christianity, right? So like, is his birthday really December 25th? I don't know. To me, that doesn't matter as much, right?
Yeah. There's one thing that matters a whole lot, though, right? Did he die for our sins, and was he resurrected? And when you look at that, you can look at it from a perspective kind of like an attorney putting together a case.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one thing that always sticks with me and I can't get over. Because let's get it clear. Jesus is either exactly who he said he was, or he's a crazy person. There's really no in between, right? The fact that the Bible is written by eyewitnesses during the time of other eyewitnesses, and you have his followers, many of whom were brutally executed because of their faith, and not one of them, as they were being executed, said, you know what, all right, you guys got us, this has gone far enough. We made it all up. Don't you think that one of them would have said something like that to spare their own life if this weren't true?
100%. I agree with that, but for me, it's also like what I first started to come into resonance with, even like last year, was the idea of grace. And the idea that like, when you look at the math of the universe almost, right? In God's creation, if you will. Like the flaw is built in, right? So even just that idea that God incarnated as Jesus, whether allegorically or not, is there to tell me that God put in the design that I'm flawed. And that I have to start having grace with myself because God loves me today. You know? And so whether or not the story is 100% true, whether or not all those disciples, all that, because I think that we're so far outside of that history that those stories could easily have been manipulated. But for me,
I'm going to send you a video about
please,
that.
please, I've heard that same thing about the eyewitnesses, and I think for a lawyer it definitely resonates, right? But I'm more a mystic, and I'm more mystically minded. I've done my work with psychedelics, and
They would have had to modify so many ancient texts in so many different languages and nobody get caught and make it identical that it's, statistically impossible that stuff was changed that way. I'll send you a really good video.
I would love it. I would love it. But again, I think for me, it's a kind of, I just reposted a Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talk where he's just like, let me just lean into this. Let me act as if. And I think I started kind of acting as if, and then every day, God and Jesus keep proving themselves to me, right? Every day since I started just saying, my wife and I, we've been praying over our food for a long time, right? You get into like the one Japanese scientist who did the water studies and is like, okay, we can change water molecules by intention and by words. Then you get into somatics, and I was an audio engineer. I came to Hollywood, went to LA recording school, again, right down the street. You learned about, I thought I was going to school to learn about recording music, but I really learned that I was learning quantum physics, right? And how vibration works. And then so you get into that. So we started blessing our food. We were talking to God through our food, asking for grace in that food, asking for strength, and giving gratitude to the people that brought the food to our table and the food itself. And then all of a sudden, ever since I started putting the in Jesus' name, started saying the Lord's Prayer before I go to bed. It's just, again, there's been even more mathematical improbabilities in my own life that like now I don't need to even think about necessarily the eyewitness part of it. And I 100% hear what you're saying, and if that's what some people need, hey, to each their own. But for me personally, it's been just even a little bit more mystical than that. And then I found out about, how Paul is a little more mystical. And I'm a big fan of like Manly P. Hall's work and Rudolf Steiner, right? And these guys are kind of talking about more like the results. Rudolf Steiner has a whole thing about the Christ impulse and how just like look how things have changed. You're coming from, and at my church last week, that's one of the big parts of the sermon was recognizing like, like before the Lamb of God, we literally killed lambs up in here. There was literally, you'd have to bring in your best chicken, cut off the head of and you wouldn't even see it happen. You'd give it to the priest, and the priest would take it behind a curtain, and they would sacrifice a chicken, right? So when now you're saying Jesus is the way, it's like, well, this guy was given to us as that sacrificial lamb to end all that. Because God's like, yo, guys, this is out of control. Let me come down there in first person, and let me show you that, like, it's okay. Like, I built these flaws into the system. You don't got to sacrifice the chicken anymore. Like, you're not going to be perfect, and you don't need to give us, your goat anymore. Like, your sins are forgiven. Be good to each other. Practice these couple principles that we've been talking about for a long time, right, in the commandments. And I think Jesus...
he had to pay that sacrifice, though, that ultimate sacrifice.
100%.
And do you feel... because you're talking a lot about personal experience here. Do you feel some way about the fact that, in this belief system, Jesus died for your sins? Like, you're talking about God's love, how much God loves you. That's a lot of love to be willing to die for somebody, right?
No, 100%. And I think that gives us the grace to live in service. And it's like we don't have to make that ultimate sacrifice because that was already done. But then the way, like how do you live that way? And that's to be of service. It's to do your best to get out of your ego. It's the best to show up. One of my favorite movies is Jerry Maguire. And I think in that movie it talks about the Quan, right? And that's that level of consciousness where you're being a servant. And you're not doing it for yourself, but you're doing it in service to other people. And that's what Jesus is telling us in the Bible, is like to be the leader, you got to serve. I can't pick who's the right hand or the left hand. Like, just be a service. And God will figure that out, because I don't even make that call. My Father makes that call, right? And I haven't been that studious in the Bible, but that's one of the things that stuck out lately, is that at any point, as long as you just give that over and can come to that conclusion at some point, it doesn't matter if I think it's in Matthew, when he's talking about basically the two sons, and one of this guy has some land, and he goes and he asks his two sons to go work the land. The first son says, yeah, or no, he says no, and then he comes back and is like, you know what, I'm going to go do this. And the other one said, yeah, right from the beginning, but never actually fulfilled the promise. And then it also says about how that basically the word that Jesus uses for like the politicians and political class, like they'll get to heaven before you guys. Like, if you guys don't fully believe in me and you want to remain skeptical, even though you're out here like kind of showboating it, in a sense, like I think that's the story at the end of, when he's with the thief. Like, that thief never did anything. Like, he was never in alignment. But in that moment, he saw that sacrifice being made, and it was like, yo, this guy's for real. I'm coming with you. So again, that's been my experience, is that's where I resonate, and kind of like it's been presented to me in such a strong light that like I just at this point I believe, and I'm just leaning into it, and every week things are getting better, and I see things change, and what it really inspired me was like athletes in the 2020 Olympics. Look at how many athletes that were up there getting that gold medal. They're like, thank you, Jesus. I couldn't have done this without Jesus, right? Because it's recognizing there's something outside of me that can also give me strength. Because then if I look out and I see that the sun's up and that the birds are singing and that I can still breathe in air today and all these good things are happening, then like, hey, like I can have faith and I can move forward. So for me, it just doesn't have to be, I no longer have to need like the essay and be able to really grade the essay. It's about being in the humility that even if I don't fully understand it at that level, like a lawyer would, that's okay. That if I lean into it and I get into my belief and I really like do my best to walk that example and do my best to read the book and to interpret it the best way that I can, to me the path just keeps unfolding, and I think that's what I would encourage anybody to do, is just because, I still see a lot of people that are like, well, if you do yoga, how can you be a Christian and do yoga? How can you be a Christian and do this? How can you be a Christian? And it's just like, it's exhausting, So to me, it's about that personal relationship and how's God showing up in your life. Last year, I went out in my garden, and all of a sudden, a fig tree is in my garden. I didn't plant the fig tree. None of my neighbors that I can see have a fig tree, but I have a fig tree. And I look it up. I'm like, does this have significance? And I look up, what's the significance of a fig tree? And then there it is in the Bible, like multiple times, a fig tree. So like, for me, it's become very psychedelic and very like trippy. And so that like, there's my logical part of my brain that's had enough of those type of experiences as just like, Nathan, dive in. The more that you can proclaim it, because a lot of me is like my fear. A lot of like there's been like the fear of society. That's why I was coded about the way I was even supporting Trump, or even that I was like leaning in that direction, because I was afraid of what my friends were going to say. I was afraid of what people were going to say. And then it's very clear in the Bible, like you're going to either like stand up for me, or you're going to like basically quiver in the face of man. So now it's just like, it's almost like a challenge. Like, I'm going to talk about Jesus. Like, let me just push on this. Let me not be afraid. Let me step into this. And like every day, like just things are happening that just seem more beautiful. Life is a little bit easier, even through the challenges, and I'm attracting more people that are showing me that it's like, yo, you can like live in Hollywood and like, you know, dive into your religion and your spirituality and have conversations and recognize that everybody's on a different part of the path. And if I can give room to you to be a part of your path, the same way I would hope that somebody would give me, because like part of my path, again, getting back to the people that are like, you can't do yoga. Like yoga was me coming back to God from being an atheist, then an agnostic. So if that's the first thing that you can, you know, a lot of it to me is metaphorical to like my path with wellness and health food. A lot of people, they got to start off with Jamba Juice. You go from McDonald's, then you're like, well, I'm at the mall. Let me do something a little bit healthier. Let me go to Jamba Juice. And then you might end up at Erewhon. You might end up at Rainbow Acres. But it's okay to start at Jamba Juice. And if I demonize the guy that's starting at Jamba Juice and really, really believes that this is his best foot forward, then I got to give him that grace. And I got to recognize that I don't know, because God has shown me so many times that this thing is far outside of my understanding. And if I just have faith and I do what's best for me and my heart in the moment, I'm going to come out the other side.
There's a really delicate balance somewhere in there, because you're talking about being unashamed of your faith and at the same time not demonizing people like you were talking about. And there are so many people like yourself who have had awful experiences with human beings in the church, or human beings who claim to be Christian. And they put people off from Jesus, and it's terrible. I want to talk a little bit about the atheist AA, if to whatever extent you can share, because you made it sound really intriguing. What were the kinds of things that you were hearing in there?
I can't even remember at this point. I probably went to only like 2 meetings.
Okay.
But it was the heavy contrast to the meetings that were in alignment with God and with the big book. Because in the big book, it says very clearly, like, the third step is, like, you got to give your life over to God or the higher power of your understanding, right? And the atheist viewpoint, in my experience, is so humanistic, right? And intellectual, that when you're looking at it comparatively, I would much rather hang out with these people than these guys. And it's not judgment against these guys, but it's just like, it just seemed hopeless. It just seemed like the worst episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm without a punchline. You know, and then on the contrast, you see these people that are very much like in the book, right? And anybody that's looking, this was at the Cafe Tropical in Silver Lake that I had this experience where my sponsor at the time pulled me outside and we're going to pray out here.
Wow.
And it was just like, wait a minute, like these people have found solution. These people have found a way to work through that darkness in themselves and end up on a more optimistic side of the fence. Where just the atheists, it just there wasn't that optimism. There wasn't that the joy and the freedom, right? In the big book, it was either in the big book or one of the core Alcoholics Anonymous books. It talks about, you know, you do this step work and you're going to be rocketed into the 5th dimension. And to me, that's because you're clearing your karma. When you look at, you know, one of the passages in the Bible talks about Jesus washing the feet. I look at that metaphorically, right? When you're born again, you only got to wash your feet. And your feet are representative of like your daily activity, right? And that's one of the steps is like once you've worked through the past stuff and then almost become born again, now all you got to deal with is like as often as you want to look at that again, I forget the step, but now as often as you're doing that 10th, I think it's the 10th or 11th step, maybe the 9th step, like the more you're aware of your resentments, the more you're aware of the things that you did wrong in the day, whether you're doing it daily, whether you're doing it monthly, whether you're doing it 6 months, the more that you take that inventory and basically repent for it, right? They use different language, but it's the same principle, same action. The more that you can repent for that, the more you're going to be free, the more you're going to move into that 5th dimensional consciousness, which allows people the grace to have their own experience, you know? And then you can be there and look at things from that different perspective of it's again, it's not good or bad, but it's we all have these aspects. And the more I can love you the way that God loves us, the way Jesus was here to love us through all of our good and bad, As long as, like, and that's maybe the thing I still struggle with a little bit, is that there is a couple clear fine lines in the Bible, and Jesus says, well, you have to believe in me at some point. But again, I'm just leaning into it because it seems like for me, there's been way more personal evidence and even intellectual evidence that, like, hey, if I lean into this and if I really put my faith in this, I'm going to have a better life and I'll have a better time on this earth. And that's been my experience.
When you see the people in AA, the atheist version, do you think that a lot of them probably had some bad experiences with Christian individuals that led them there?
100%. And I've gone to the point, and I've read parts of the Satanic Bible, and the intuitive feeling that I picked up reading the Satanic Bible was like, this guy had a bad time at church.
Really?
This was the causation, right? The causation wasn't that this guy was inherently evil. This guy had a bad experience, right? And that made his pendulum swing the complete opposite way, right? And so kind of now the way I look at things is like, I look at things like almost from the lens of, and this is kind of funny, but I look at the lens of like Willy Wonka. Like, I think the devil's just Slugworth, right? The devil's the opportunity, the negative characteristics in all of us that wants to feed into their ego and go like, you're going to do what's best for you? Or are you going to do what's best for everybody? And so that's why I don't really have faith or resonate, or I don't have fear in the devil, and I don't like resonate with like kind of religious people that are like good, bad, line in the sand, because it's like God created this whole thing, right? And that's even like the story of Judas. Like Judas was like trusted guy. Like Jesus said, like, you got to go do this, but this is the only way that like it's going to prove my point, And without fear, he went and then died on the cross, knowing who he was. Right, so I think in entertainment, and we've related this allegory multiple times different ways, and I feel like for me, that's the road that God kind of put me on, that I was able to watch these things and I was able to pick up on all these little nuggets, and then you reach a certain age where you have these quantum leaps of consciousness that's like, Like, you can watch Willy Wonka 100 times, but then it took me till like literally in my early 40s or my late 30s to look at it from that perspective, And so we can find truth in so many different things, but it's really just God telling us from all sorts of different angles so that we can come to this experience.
Now, when you were an atheist, was that driven primarily by your experience in the church, or did you have doubts that God existed for other reasons?
I think I didn't even really believe in that necessarily. Like, there was a big turning point in my life, again, it was a movie. It was the movie Stigmata, right? And in Stigmata, they're trying to get to this point of more of like a Gnostic point of view, where it's like Jesus and God is saying, like, I'm in the rock, I'm in the stone, I'm in the piece of wood, I'm in the splinter. Like, God is everywhere. Right? In the big book, it says, God is everything or nothing. You decide. Right? You get into like Hermetic philosophy, the Kabbalion. Again, the all is the all. It's this thing. Like, you can't escape it. Right? And we have aspects of it, right? But we're not it. Right? So that's come up to me as a theme so many times in my life that I can't separate myself from that. So the atheism was more like me not really resonating with the church. And I grew up Lutheran, which was already a reformation from Catholicism. So that's already kind of, that nature is already kind of built into the ethos is what I'm thinking, that, hey, this thing isn't perfect. Let's make an adjustment. But then because of that, I started judging Christ again by more what my feelings in the church than really having grace for the people in that church. So I think I was probably always a little more agnostic than I was atheist, but there's not a lot of agnostic AA meetings. And I'm not like going to AA meetings anymore. I think that was just a part of my life. But I was kind of exploring that topic. So I would never say I was like a hardliner atheist. it was me starting to probably get into my ego a little bit more. But it was more of like put my toe in the hot tub and not like, I didn't like jump in and really like explore it to its depths, you know?
Do you think that, aside from the political challenges that we've been talking about, do you think that we have an issue in this country where people are moving away from God?
I would have said yes about 8 years ago, 10 years ago. But what I'm seeing now is again, it's I've been very inspired. I think the funny thing, about algorithms is, and these apps, they want to keep you on there, right? So whether you're looking at the thing that the society and what some people think is like the political parties are trying to get you to watch, at the end of the day, the more that you invest on those apps, they're just going to show you what's going to keep you on there. And so I've been finding a lot of Christian, spiritual, Jesus-related content, where like 10 years ago, not so much. There was a lot more mystical content. There was a lot more, people come into resonance with yoga. People come into resonance kind of out of very like an almost agnostic, atheist time period coming out of like the late 2000 era, right? And then when Instagram hit, that original idea of woke was about enlightenment, was about connection to God, right? That was the woke, that was the wake up. Again, it wasn't just purely about politics and knowing that the American government is not perfect. I think if you read, one of my big influences as a kid was reading High Times, and so High Times broke the bubble on like our government being perfect a long time ago, for me. But then there was that connection to God, and that's where I resonated with yoga, because yoga's union with God, whether or not you can compartmentalize it and say, well, it's Hindu and it's like these gods, but like
You're doing yoga for Jesus?
almost, now. To me, I feel like if Jesus was around now, he'd be doing yoga. I feel like Jesus would be talking and like he would be exploring all these things and like and having a good time and like really, giving grace to people. And we're in an information age. We're in a period where, Jesus was alive in a very specific time period, in the Middle East with very specific points of view. And we don't even have all the records of the whole time when he was here. There's a lot of, things that I've seen that says that he actually was traveling around quite a bit, and he had a lot of different experiences on different continents throughout Eurasia, and that he studied. But then also like course corrected people and was like, but kind of like maybe you should look at it like this, Again, I don't know that to be 100% fact, but for me personally, there's enough there to me to like lean into the fact that for me, I feel like he'd probably be hanging out talking to people about their gods and talking to people about, as long as it's leaning toward the productive and we're not sacrificing things. I think that was the biggest lesson in that time period with Judaism at the time, it was about breaking down those barriers. That's about like, hey, it's the Sabbath, but like if somebody's dying, Sabbath or not, like we're going to help this person. Right? But because it's like, hey, this is Sabbath, we got to let this person just die on the streets, that doesn't sit right. Like we don't need to kill these animals anymore in the temple. So that was like a very specific time period, and I think that we should learn that lesson from Jesus, and we should 100% move into that, but like exploring each other's culture and having grace for each other's culture, and then sharing the gospel and how it's affecting us personally. That's another thing that I really always resonated with AA, was like it's attraction, not promotion. And there is, a certain level of evangelism that's built into the Bible. But again, for me personally, it's about the balance of living in such a way that when you do show up to somebody's house, when you do show up in somebody's neighborhood, if you're saying, I have the good word, you got to lean on the good word. You got to lean on how it saved you. You got to lean on how it pulled you out of the abyss, right? Because as soon as I go to your house and I say, hey, you're in the abyss, from a psychological standpoint, I'm going to put you in defense mechanism. And you're far less likely to hear my testimony than if I just like, hey, let's hang out.
Right.
Let's break bread. Like, let's talk. Let's vibe. And then you get on an actual personal level with people, and this is my position with health food as well, right? I want people to say, man, you look good.
Yeah.
What are you doing? Right? And then once you're at that level and you're already energetically putting that off, right? So if you're already energetically putting that off, somebody's going to come to you like, damn, what are you doing? You just, every time I see you, you're in a good mood. Every time I see you, you remember my name. When I'm working at retail environments, people are like, how do you remember my name already? Oh, Lion's Mane, this stuff works, right? So like, now it's like, well, what are you doing? Oh, I've been studying the Bible. I've been going to church, right? Yoga led me to do this stuff, right? My faith in God has led me now back to the faith that I grew up with, So like, if you're not feeling optimal, maybe there's another way, right? And again, I think that each person comes here with their own path, right? But as long as you're walking that example and you're living it, to me, that's what God has shown me as the best course of action. And if I'm in my heart and I'm gracious to people, and I start with myself, being gracious to myself and my flaws and the things that I've done wrong, and I repent to them, like from my heart, like deeply. I've had some really deep, amazing cries, where I've had to release a lot of my own self-resentment. Now I can show up for other people because it's like, I know that I'm not perfect and God's given me grace for myself, so like, let's talk it out. Let's look at your life from a different perspective as opposed to crystallizing you in what I deem is to be wrong.
Now, I want to go back to something you said. You said that for a while you were very quiet about the fact that you supported Trump at all, and you didn't want to mention that. It's because of the people that you're spending time with, and you're concerned about what they would think about it?
To a degree, and also to a degree where like I could see the polarization, and I could see how, at least from the internet, it's very easy then to just like then put me in a box. And so I did have some fear that like, hey, and there was a lot of conversations with my wife and having compassion for what people were going through and trying to do my best to understand that like, this is not who my friend really is. Like, I know that if I was in person, my friend, we would actually be having a conversation. But if I'm inciting things on an app without, and I used to do this, I used to kind of like soft red pill people where I'd be putting out my ideas, but I wouldn't give a lot of context and I wouldn't give a lot of insight into what I was thinking. But that was I guess my fear was like, if I really put myself out there, now I'm going to be put in this box. As people, like a couple jobs I had even in person. Oh, you're a Trumper? I'm like, not really. But like, if you're going to like talk about this guy versus this guy, like I'm resonating with him a lot more than I am with the guy that's saying I got a force of medicine in my body. Maybe you need this medicine. I don't know. But I just want the choice. But that time period was so heavily polarized that I was just cautious of, again, just being put in a box. And then what's really important to me outside of politics is the health, is the spirituality. So it's like, and I came face to face with this week. I posted something and a friend of mine got, and I'm a little, I still look at who sees my stuff, and, I saw that this individual, like they stopped at a political post of mine and we got in a little debate, and then there was something really that I felt was spiritually insightful that then they didn't see. And it just kind of made me sit back and be like, how much is the politics worth it? And I think that's the razor's edge for me a little bit, is like, how do I balance? At work, we say like we have four quadrants of urgency, like what's urgent and important, what's important and not urgent, what's not important, what's not urgent, and what's important and not urgent, and then what's neither, right? And you got to figure that out on your day-to-day basis to prioritize your time, right? And so there's certain things that are just, if you're nourished and you're looking at the lens through a spiritual or religious point of view, I feel like it gives you more insight and more compassion to deal with things on a political level. So it's like, how do I prioritize? But I'm interested in all those things. And for me in my life, I've always have been. So it's like, how do I stay true to myself and not post things, not post things out of fear, but prioritize them in the context that, like, if people are spiritually starving, if they're literally malnourished at a cellular level and are literally physiologically starving for nutrients, like, you're not going to have the capacity to think on a level that's outside of survival mode, right? And so, like, where is it my opportunity to prioritize those things and help people, help give the same insight that kind of led me to this conclusion? Because if I was the same person I was physiologically in 2010, I don't know that I would be able to look at things from the lens I look at it. And I also, my wife and I, we don't have kids yet. So I also understand that, like, a lot of people with kids, their time is even more limited. So they're not even able to do as much research on certain topics as I am. So again, how do I prioritize these things, knowing that if your gut health is bad, right? A lot of serotonin is produced in the gut. But if you're eating food that is, heavily coated in Roundup, right, and glyphosate, and now you're destroying your stomach bacteria, you're no longer to produce a healthy amount of serotonin. So your mental health is suffering. You're going to be quickly triggered. You're going to be seeking outside things to even fill that gap in your own happiness. Like, how do I prioritize that and get that message out? Because the political thing is almost is the most emotionally charged thing, I think, collectively right now. But if you can't at a micro level handle this nutrition aspect, which then allows you to come to a different conclusion spiritually, like, how are you going to have grace for people in a political spectrum?
That's fascinating. You're a very unique fellow. And this conversation was every bit as interesting as I suspected it would be after I saw your page. I'm really glad that I came across your page
Sweet.
because, 1.5 million people saw that video, and I just happened to come across your page and said, this guy's got to come on the show.
Hey, Philly boys, we find each other.
Yeah,
we
what
find each
county
other.
were you from?
I grew up in Berks County.
Okay.
I grew up in a small farm town, Ole, Pennsylvania.
Familiar with Ole.
Really?
I've given seminars at gun clubs out in
Are you
Ole.
serious?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Pikeville?
Been to Pikeville? Absolutely. Yeah. We just, I was just talking to somebody who lives in Berks County on the phone last night or the night before, and she lives near Ole. Because I was asking about where she lived and said, near Ole.
That's wild. 'Cause my dad still lives on Route 73, like directly down the street from Pikeville Gun Club.
Yeah. I don't want to out the person. Say that she lives in the general area, but she knows who she is. She's definitely watching the program right now.
That's rad. That's
Yeah.
rad. Yeah, so I grew up there. I lived there till I was, just before I turned 19. I moved to Philadelphia in Center City I am a DJ, and I moved to Philadelphia to pursue DJing, to work with the legendary Substitution, drum and bass, jungle crew in Philly. Used to throw shows, and I lived in Center City until I was about 20, right before my 24th birthday. Or I moved here, right after my 24th birthday. So I lived there for about 5 years. And, it's still, Pennsylvania's still home. Los Angeles is also home. I think, your heart can be in two places at once when you really love people.
Yeah.
Even if you're not physically there all the time. And I'm just so grateful for the experience because it's what had really grounded me. And when I look back and think about, Amish has come up a lot lately, and then you're looking at, like, organic farming. It's like these people have been doing it. And some of the best organic food in that whole region is the foods that have been growing, in the Amish communities. So I just feel very blessed that I had that opportunity to grow up in that area. And now, it gives me the opportunity to see things from multiple points of view.
Do you ever make it back?
Not as often as I would like. It's been a long time. My mom now lives in Long Island. Um, I have a really interesting family life. I have my biological father was in South Carolina. He just passed away in November he was battling ALS
Oh, I'm sorry
for
to hear
about 5 years. It's one of the reasons why I wore the Hawaiian out. I was like, my dad grew up in Guam and Hawaii and always wore flip-flops and a Hawaiian shirt. But, through divorce and some things, I ended up back in Pennsylvania. But that's the family that I haven't seen as much in person, but is always on my mind. And I'm actually supposed to visit in the next few months.
Well, keep me posted because maybe we'll do round 2 of this on the East Coast.
That would be rad.
That would be cool,
That would
right?
be rad, yeah.
All right. Thanks so much for joining
Yeah,
us.
my pleasure.
We miss you, Ellie. Daddy loves you.